throughout the 1930s, Hitler made a series of brilliant political judgments. He sensed that if he sent troops into the Rhineland, no one would do anything. He sensed that if he annexed Austria, no one would do anything. That if he took the Sudetenland, no one would do anything. And all of that was true. Time after time, his generals said, look, don't do it. You're risking everything. Germany is going to get trounced. And he said, don't worry, our enemies will not do anything. And he was right about all of that. But as soon as the war broke out, he starts making a series of disastrous decisions. Yeah?
Could you also argue from the revisionist point of view where Hitler wasn't like actually acting as he was like had a clear rule in mind of radical use of advantage? He was really just carrying on wishes of a lot of other parties in the Nazi Germany and that they just like actually happened.
All right, yeah, the question is, to what extent did Hitler have a plan, and to what extent was he reacting to events and reacting to outside pressures? I think it's hard to know that because, in a sense, it's hard to know enough about the workings of the inner circle in Germany to be sure what kinds of pressures he was under. Certainly among the top command, he was under pressure not to do the things he did. So was he under some pressure to do them? Well, maybe politically, he certainly had been opposed from the very beginning to the Treaty of Versailles. Part of what he had campaigned upon as early as 1923, what led to the Munich Beer Hall Putsch and his imprisonment, when he wrote down in Mein Kampf, all of that suggested a plan very much like what he put into practice in the sense of rolling back the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So was that in itself a response to what he perceived the political climate in Germany as being? Was it his own independent thought? I think it's hard to say because really I think most Germans felt that the treaty was unjust. And so there would have been large popular support for unrolling that. Is the way that he did it something that was driven by a predetermined plan, or was it something that was driven by events? Again, a little hard to say. I think to some extent he was an opportunist. It was after winning the Tsar plebiscite so overwhelmingly, for example, that he went and sent troops into the Rhineland, and he may have had the sense that this gave him the opening. He could point to an area that was actually further toward France than the Rhineland and say 90% of the people have voted there to reunite with Germany, and so on. This area in between, surely that's part of Germany too. It made it easier to justify his claim. And so I think it's hard to answer that question. In short, I'm inclined to think most of the German public was in favor of these things, and to some extent he had promised to do this kind of thing from the very outset. So the exact order of events is hard to say. One thing that conceivably was a mistake was taking Prague. As we'll see, his next move was to attack Poland. Well, actually, we've already seen that. His next move was to attack Poland. But remember the Danzig corridor. A big section of what became Poland had been taken from Germany. So if he had moved on Poland first, he still could have claimed, I'm reversing the Treaty of Versailles. But by taking Prague, which was never part of Germany, he really had no such justification. And that was what awoke Neville Chamberlain to this, to his character and to the nature of the betrayal. Suppose he had moved first on Poland and then had moved against Czechoslovakia. It's not clear to me how that would have played out. So to what extent was that basically everything else would accord with, you might say, both sources until he gets there. And then what drove that decision? I'm not sure. So when it comes down to the hard cases, I don't know if it's easy to tell how to draw that distinction. From that time on, though, you might say, what was he thinking? Why was he motivated to attack Prague first? And why was he, in particular, then pursuing the war the way he did? He begins initially having a string of victories with the blitzkrieg against the Scandinavian countries, the move through the Low Countries, getting France to fall very quickly and so on. But then he starts making some mistakes. One of them is during the Battle of Britain, which we talked about. He several times came close to knocking the British out of the war. For example, to get the idea that he couldn't really defeat the Royal Air Force, except by keeping its planes on the ground. So instead of attacking the planes themselves, he had a bombing campaign against the airfields in Britain. He was trying to destroy the airfields so that the Royal Air Force had nowhere to take off and nowhere to land. If he had done it for one more week, Churchill admitted, he would have defeated the Royal Air Force. They would have had nowhere to land. But he tried it for 2 to 3 weeks, didn't see results. There were still places where they could land and take off. The Royal Air Force still seemed to be powerful, and so he gave up on that strategy. That happened several times throughout this period. Hitler had a strategy which, if pursued for about another week, would have driven the British out of the war. And he made the decision to give up because it didn't work quickly enough. In a sense, he became spoiled. Denmark, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway. All of those were easy enough victories that he thought everything should be easy. When something wasn't easy, he gave up much too quickly. Yeah?
As far as that airfield bomb, people also took advantage of by sending bombers to attack Berlin. It would probably said, okay, well, that kind of attack's not going to take lightly. Took in bombers instead of bombing airfields in London and started taking care of that. So.
That's a good point. When the British bombed Berlin, he decided to change strategy and began bombing cities. And you might say that was an unwise decision in several respects. And you can understand it from both an emotional point of view and to some extent a view on military strategy. Look, if they're strong enough still to bomb Berlin, then maybe that's a sign his strategy isn't working. And so that may be part of what drove him to adapt. At the time, Churchill really thought of it as nothing more than a symbolic gesture. But you're right, maybe it was actually much more than a symbolic gesture. Or maybe, to put it another way, symbolic gestures can actually have a huge impact on the way people make decisions. Now, there's a much broader issue that arises in connection with the war. There were two obvious strategies that both Hitler and the Japanese, who were allied with him, might have pursued. One was a northern strategy directed at Russia, to attack Russia from both east and west. Another was a southern strategy directed at the Middle East, at the Far East, and at India, northern Africa. Here's what's odd. Germany chose as its primary focus the northern strategy, and Japan the southern strategy. So they were in effect going like this, which didn't actually make very much military sense. If you look at the map of the world there, you can think, well, all right, yes, one side is Japan, one side is Germany. How are you going to ultimately unite forces? Well, you could try going through the Western Hemisphere and across the United States, but suppose you don't want to do that. Well, you could go sort of in the north, avoiding the mountains in the west of China and the Himalayas and so forth, or you could go to the south. But it looked as if they really should coordinate. Now, there might have been an early attempt to coordinate, but it was given up on pretty quickly. There are two broad views of history here. One, according to which history is basically the record of people in important positions making important decisions. That's often called the great man theory of history in a somewhat sexist fashion. And there's also something that is the version of historical determinism. It doesn't really have to be deterministic, but the idea here really is that it's not individual decisions, it's broad social forces that really drive events in history. And individual people have little or no free will, they really have little or no effect on history. Well, there's a sense in which World War II gives you a dramatic illustration of something that appears to be in support of the first. At any rate, it's hard to see large-scale social forces driving Hitler or Stalin or the Japanese to do a variety of things. It really looks like individual wills, individual decisions that took things in a certain direction. Johnson puts it this way: Hitler and Stalin played chess with humanity. Neither represented irresistible or even potent historical forces. We have here the very opposite of historical determinism, the apotheosis of a single autocrat. People making individual decisions that are crucial. And so, in particular, the one that interests us is Operation Barbarossa. Hitler decided to attack the Soviet Union. And so on June 22nd, 1941, he launched an attack against Stalin. The Russian troops on the front line in Poland were absolutely astounded. They were completely unprepared for this. They began yammering about being under attack. People shouted back, "What's the matter with you? Why aren't these transmissions in code?" But the answer is people were panicked. There was, remember, an alliance between Hitler and Stalin at this point. They had agreed to divide up Poland, and the Russians were completely surprised by Hitler's turnabout and his attack against the Soviet Union. Now, Hitler had two goals in doing this. One was to create additional Lebensraum, living space for the German people, to take over the Ukraine and Byelarussia, these areas that were fertily producing grain. In short, military conquest of Russian territory, at least up to the Urals. But also social engineering. And he sent groups, the Einsatzgruppen, to try to enforce that in doing this. These were incompatible goals. Actually, by 1941, Stalin was not especially popular. There was purge after purge. The famine of the 1930s, the early 30s, that was to some extent engineered, persisted throughout much of the 30s. The Russian economy was in terrible condition. People were hungry. If Hitler had gone into Russia as a liberator, he might well have actually gotten many of the Russian people to turn and fight against Stalin on his side. But instead, he sent the Einsatzgruppen there to kill Jews, but also to kill other people viewed by the Germans as undesirable. The Russians hated Stalin and might have joined Hitler, well, especially the Ukrainians and the people in what's today Belarus didn't have any fondness for Stalin. But on the other hand, the Einsatzgruppen shot 1 million Russians during 1941 alone. And I'm not talking here about Russian soldiers, I'm just talking about Russian civilians, shot because they were Russian. In about half the cases, shot because they were Jewish. But in not all cases by any means was there even any suspicion of being Jewish. It was really enough to be Slavic. And the Russians realized they faced a war of extermination. So, in June of 1941, already the SS began mass murders. July 3rd, Stalin ordered a scorched earth policy. He basically said, destroy anything that might be of value to the invaders. Destroy your farms, burn the fields, kill all the animals, do anything to destroy anything that could be of help to the German army and get out of the way, retreat. And so essentially he said, scorch the earth, burn it all to the ground, and head to the east away from the German army. But don't leave anything they could use. It created a huge supply problem for Hitler. The army couldn't live off the land, it had to ship supplies from Germany. And that, as they advanced more and more to Russia, became more and more a logistical problem. Now, Stalin ended up shooting many army officers in the late 30s, as we've seen. He shot even more now to prevent mutinies or coups. He sent former POWs to prison camps. He imprisoned the families of POWs. Now, why would you do that? You were taken prisoner by the Germans, let's say. Why would you or your families be sent to prison camps? Why would they be shot? Well, partly so that you don't give information, but to some extent it's just so you will fight to the death. And at a certain point in the war, he basically told troops behind the front lines, shoot anybody in the front lines who attempts to flee or desert, or in other ways, not fight against the enemy. And so people were really forced to this. They had no choice but to fight to the death. Well, here you see, actually, the Einsatzgruppen executing a variety of people. And this happened to 1 million times in 1941 alone, lining people up and shooting them in the head. In many cases, having them dig mass graves first and shooting people in the head, dumping them directly into graves. In a lot of cases, the shot didn't kill people. There would be people moaning, writhing down here. And then eventually the dirt was just covered over. So people were in many cases buried alive, but wounded. Here's someone else being shot just because he looked Russian. Well, in any event, the Russians quickly realized that between Stalin on the one side, who was willing to shoot them if they didn't fight, and Hitler on the other side, who was willing to shoot them if they didn't fight, people had no choice but to fight this invasion to the death. On July 31st, Hitler gave the order for what he called the final solution, the mass extermination of Jews. Shooting Jews in Russia had already been taking place. Now he said in any area under German control. On September 1st, he ordered the Jews to wear yellow stars to identify themselves. And September 3rd was the first use of the gas chambers at Auschwitz. By September 19th, the Germans had taken Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and within 10 days, the Nazis had murdered almost 34,000 Jews in Kiev. Here you see a Jewish man wearing the yellow star. Here you see 2 Jewish children wearing the yellow star. Both of them shortly thereafter died in the camps. October 2nd, the Germans were now close to Moscow, but the first snowflakes fell. Think about the fact that the attack began June 22nd. How much time do you have to advance toward Moscow if you start June 22nd? Not very much time, it turned out. October 2nd was the beginning of the snowfall. By November 27th, the German commander sent back a message to Hitler, we have reached the end of our human and material forces. And from that point on, Germany was on the defensive. December 5th, the Germans abandoned the attack. December 6th, the Russians counterattacked. And from then on, Hitler was reacting to events. He was in retreat. Let's return to our discussion of World War II. So far, basically throughout the 1930s, and up until, you might say, the attack on Russia, Hitler was making a series of very good decisions. Consistently, the German generals opposed him. They said, look, this makes no military sense. It makes no political sense. You're going to get Germany defeated. This is going to be an embarrassing, humiliating defeat. They were ready at several different stages to arrest him, but again and again he managed to correctly predict that the Allies would do nothing. And by the end of the 30s, he had taken full control of the army. Well, the generals by that point had more or less said, well, we'll defer to his judgment. It still makes no sense to us. Nevertheless, he's been right time after time. Maybe we should trust him more than our own judgment. However, at the beginning of 1941, you might say, he began to make a series of very serious mistakes. And one of them was the attack on Russia. Mounting it at all, really, is one mistake, I think. Mounting it on June 22nd, after you've had to delay for a couple of months due to bad weather, that's another serious mistake. They did not have time to reach Moscow before the winter snows hit. But we'll see there was another serious mistake. Let's shift our discussion to the Pacific War for a moment. The United States was engaged in a conflict with Japan, not at this point a military conflict yet, but nevertheless a kind of competing set of interests in the Pacific. Japan felt that the United States was limiting Japanese assets, was conducting a kind of embargo against Japan, was in various ways impeding Japan's economic and political interests. Conversely, Japan was exerting increasing influence throughout the Pacific and through other parts of Asia. They had attacked Manchuria in 1931, very brutally so. Were still conducting a war in China to take over China. Had done the same thing with Korea. Were in general pushing their influence toward the south and the east. South and the east, yes, but also south and west into Southeast Asia. And here is a little map indicating that. You can see Manchuria there in blue, which Japan had already taken over. You see Japan pushing in further into China, in the northeastern part of China. Japan had also moved on Taiwan, on the Philippines, on French Indochina, on Thailand, and all of those were moves that Japan was taking either before the actual outbreak of the Pacific War or in the early stages of that war. Well, the conflict with Japan led to the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Here you see the Honolulu Star Bulletin, first extra, special edition, War, Oahu bombed by Japanese planes. This was something that really came out of the blue, and that isn't just a sad metaphor, given that, that it was an aerial attack. It really was something that startled the American command. It's not that people weren't aware of the possibility of war. There had been rising tensions with the Japanese all throughout 1941. Nevertheless, this was something that was dramatically new. And people did not expect this kind of attack, especially an attack like this mounted over a very large area. Much of the Pacific War was conducted from aircraft carriers in just the way that this foreshadowed. And yet at this point, I don't think people anticipated that. They didn't think of Hawaii as a likely subject of attack. But it was. The Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and was able to destroy a surprisingly large percentage of the American Pacific Fleet. Well, the United States then quickly declared war on Japan. And Roosevelt gave his famous speech yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy. And quickly the country rallied around him and declared war on Japan. Now here's one of the things that Hitler did wrong. The very next day, Hitler declared war against the United States. He was bound to do that by a treaty with Japan. On the other hand, it essentially guaranteed his defeat. And so it was, from that point of view, a very serious mistake. Hitler really had planned initially in Mein Kampf that the fight against the United States would come some 50 years hence. In other words, that would have been from the 1920s, what? Well, say the 1970s, after he was gone. But he sped things up, given Japan's attack and the American declaration of war. It basically meant that the gain in balance of power he had managed by taking over Czechoslovakia was lost, because at the United States, the other side of the equation, and it was clear the balance of power was stacked against him. By this point, also his forces were in deep trouble in Russia, and so really it was a question of German retreat now on both eastern and western fronts. On both sides, he ended up now being on the losing side of the balance of power.